Before the sun rises and after the sun sets, the growers of our food are busy planting, nurturing, harvesting, working hard to feed the world. These heroes are always on call. They never give up, forever committed to doing more for people and the planet. Farmers are here for you, and we are here for farmers. Growing food has been a way of life for centuries, but the way we grow has evolved. We are leading the evolution of farming, using science to capture the data stored in soil, plants, rain, and air. Simplifying complex intelligence and turning it into actionable insights with FarmCommand, our powerful digital platform. We're giving farmers an edge with our innovative suite of digital tools, precision hardware, unmatched services, and boots-on-the-ground support. Empowering farmers all over the world to make better decisions for their farm, for the community, and for the environment. Our highly trained data scientists collect and analyze soil from different areas of the field to prescribe an efficient fertilizer application. Our weather stations that our professionals install and calibrate provide the most accurate weather data tailored to farmers' fields. Our robust suite of satellite imagery provides a detailed view of crop health even before problems arise. Brand-agnostic telematics devices installed in equipment ensure seamless data collection from anywhere, anytime. We are digitizing the farm and creating a digital ecosystem that not only connects farmers to their fields, but to key stakeholders and trusted advisors. So while yesterday's farmer had to make their best guess, today's farmer knows how to grow more, faster, and more sustainably than ever. Together, we can support the heroes that feed the world. Our commitment and dedication to innovation, science, and technology is transforming farming for the benefit of us all. Sustainable growing, a healthier planet, more food for the world. And this is only the beginning.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kinga Nolan, and I'm a product marketing intern here at Farmers Edge. And today I'm joined by Skye Feil, and she is a territory Edge working in southern Saskatchewan. And today Skye is going to be talking all about hail tools. Hey, Skye, how's it going?
Hey, Kinga, it's going good today. How are you?
Good, thanks. So Skye, FarmCommand has a hail tool. Are you able to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm just going to share my screen actually to show you what the tool looks like in FarmCommand while I talk about it. So here's a screenshot of what the hail tool looks like in FarmCommand. This is the FarmCommand Center part of FarmCommand where you can view the hail swath. So you can overview the hail swath with your field borders, which is really handy because then when a storm comes through, you can see if the storm actually hit your fields or maybe if they missed them. So I'll just walk you through how to use this tool. So you want to make sure you can select the right date range because when you're a Farmers Edge customer, if you have been for previous years, all this data is saved from year to year. So you can always look back on previous years. As well, you can pull up your field borders right here, hit the weather portion where you can select the hail size. If you tick this off, all of the different sizes will pull up, and then it gives you a legend of what you're seeing with the hail swath. The hail swath is also pretty cool because if you look at the bottom here, it will give you all of the dates in yellow where there was a hail event in that area. And if you zoom in or zoom out, more or less dates will show up based on the area that your map is viewing. So it's really handy to make scouting more efficient and see where the storm actually hit.
Skye, that's fantastic. So how exactly does the hail tool work, and where exactly are we getting our information from?
Yeah, so the hail tool works just like a radar. So if you're like me, when a storm is coming through the area, you religiously check the radar to see, like, is it going to hit my farm? How aggressive is it? And just what's coming my way. So it works the exact same way using the radar. So we get the radar information from IBM, or it used to be called the Weather Company. So that's the source of the information. But like I said, it works just like a radar. So the areas where there's maybe purple and red showing up on the radar, those are areas where traditionally we know sometimes we may be getting more rainfall, heavier rainfall, and more severe weather such as hail. So that's what it's picking up.
I'm a customer and I have these maps and I can look at them to see where hail might have hit, but how do I know if my field has actually been struck by hail besides just looking at the map view itself?
For sure. So there is another spot in FarmCommand we can look. I'll pull up a screenshot for this one as well so we can see what it looks like while I'm chatting about it. So this is Smart Claim. So you can access it in a couple different places. So same thing in FarmCommand Center, just by clicking on your assets at the top, going to the list view and Smart Claim, or just on the left-hand menu when you go into FarmCommand right away. But this is really handy, like you said, because it gives you a list view of all your fields that were affected, which is nice because then you know which ones need to be checked or which ones were affected. You can search by date range, your crop stage, and maybe see the different priorities of which fields to scout. Another nice thing is it will show all of your severe weather events. So right now we're talking about hail, but you can also see alerts for low temperature like frost, high temperature, and wind. So in the screenshot here, you can see I filtered to hail. So we're just seeing the hail events that happened across this farm. And we can easily see what crop types were on each field and what growth stage they are at. And then you can also filter by event date if you get more than one event to see the most recent one or maybe some previous ones that were affected if the same field was affected twice.
Fantastic. Well, I know Saskatchewan's been hit a lot with some crazy storms in the last couple weeks here. So how have your customers been using this tool?
Yeah, my customers actually love this tool. Everyone's been a really big fan. So I would say there's probably two main purposes. So the first one, like I was saying, knowing what fields to scout. It's going to make our scouting more efficient. And like I said, was the whole farm affected? Maybe just certain fields were affected, or even just maybe half of a field. So just making sure that we're not going to miss anything and we're checking out the right spots. The second reason I would say is just meeting with the hail adjuster and bringing these tools and aiding in those conversations. We're going to know where to check for the damage and how many acres were hit. So I've had guys that they'll print off a screenshot of the hail swath showing where it was in comparison to their fields. You can also utilize some of our supporting imagery, so like your NDVI, scouting maps, or variance maps, if it's showing where the damage has hit or has affected the fields, if not the whole field was hit. So you can print off screenshots of that as well, or PDF copies. There's also a measuring tool in FarmCommand, so you can actually click around the areas that were affected by hail and get the exact acres. So that's really handy as well, other than just eyeballing it. And again, that smart claim list, you can print that off and bring that with you as well. So lots of handy things for those conversations.
That's fantastic. Chat, so feel free to put those in and we're going to get to them at claim. But how do I actually know if my field has been hit with hail?
Yeah, good question. So obviously you can always go into FarmCommand and check for that information, but not everyone has time to do that, especially in the mornings. So there's the severe weather alerts, and they're actually text message alerts. So they get texted right to your smartphone or your mobile phone, which is awesome. It's going to give you all the important information, like the type of events. So in this case, we're talking about hail, but like I said earlier, you can get text messages for low temperatures like frost, high temperatures, wind, that kind of thing. It's also going to tell you what fields were affected and affected area. So it's going to direct your scouting really to be way more efficient because you're going to know what fields to start with, and essentially that you have something to check up on if you're away from home and didn't know that the storm had come through, or if you have fields that are far away from where your main farm is. So yeah, the text alerts are very handy. If you are a Farmer's Edge customer and you aren't signed up for these alerts, feel free to reach out to any of your Farmer's Edge representatives or specifically your account manager, and we'll make sure to get you signed up.
Fantastic. I really like the idea of having these text messages, and it's definitely pretty handy to know what's going on. So let's say, for example, I get this text message. When should I be heading out to the field?
Yeah, so it may be tempting to scout the field right after the storm, and I don't think that's a bad thing because we want to see what damage has been done and how widespread it is. But we really do want to wait a bit to see how plants are going to grow through the damage, especially before we make any decisions. So scouting a few days up to like a week after the storm to assess the damage could be ideal, just because it's going to be really difficult to determine the degree of stand loss right after the storm. And keep in mind that hail can also be extremely patchy. So just thinking about that too when we're getting out to scout.
Yeah, definitely. In terms of like damage on plants, what exactly would you expect to see?
Yeah, so it's gonna depend on a couple different things. I would say crop type, stage of the crop, and even severity of the storm are gonna affect that quite a bit. The most important factor would be timing and stage of the crop, especially when we're talking about the level of damage that we're gonna see. Because early on, our crops are gonna bounce back, whereas later on, once they're more mature, we can see quite a bit more loss and increased damage, and they're not as able to recover as they are early on. So just talking about like different stages, like early in the season, like any part of the plant that's above ground when the storm happens, we can see damage on. So that's going to be a lot of leaves. So we can see bruising and tearing of those leaves. And in some plants, like leaf drop or leaflet drop, depending what we're talking about. Once we get into that stem elongation phase, we can start to see more gaseous bruises on the stems and leaves. So again, any part of the plant that's up during the storm, but as well as breakage of stems and branches at that point. Once we get into flowering, obviously we're going to see damage at that area of the plant as well. So we can start to see some flower and petal drop. So if you walk into a field and there's maybe a canola field and there's a whole bunch of yellow flowers on the ground, obviously something knocked those off and it could have been hail, as long as there's other hail damage there as well. And then potting, same thing. We'll start to see bruises and gashes on the pods, and even some pods that are knocked off completely or have holes in them. And same thing when we're talking about our cereals with kernels. So
Yeah. So I think that's like a great explanation of how, just in general, it can affect different crops, but specific to your territory in southern Saskatchewan, do you maybe want to discuss some of the crops that you guys have, and then how hail would affect those crops at like different stages?
yeah, for sure. So like I said, I'm in Southwest Saskatchewan, so maybe I'll touch on the three main crops in our area. So we can start with canola. So canola is a very plastic crop. That's really important just because it means it's going to compensate quite a bit. So early on, when the plants are quite small, like I said, we're not going to see much of a yield impact from hail unless the cotyledons are both knocked off, or the stem is actually snapped. There's going to be quite a bit more loss then. But it's important to note that individual plants may die, but the crop as a whole can compensate quite a bit, as canola is pretty plastic that way. So once we get into more advanced stages, like 4 to 6 leaf, we might see delayed maturity and delayed plants. And obviously leaves aren't going to regrow if they're torn off. But if the active growing points are still healthy, we might see new growth from that. And just shorter plants after hail has come through. There might even be more side branches if there was damage more in the main stem area. Once we get into flowering, canola is pretty crazy that way, because if you get a light hail, it can actually overcompensate. So you might see no yield loss or actually a potential yield bump from those types of situations, because it can recover, like even if there's major flower loss, if there's enough time in the growing season left. We can also get new branches being produced if hail's more severe and knocked off a whole bunch, and that can still provide some good yield if there's enough time left in the season. But again, we're going to have maturity set back a little bit too. So once we get into that potting stage, though, we're getting to the point of more irrecoverable loss. So we can still have some regrowth, but time is a constraint with the growing season, because there may not be enough time for the crop to fully recover from the hail and then still reach maturity. So that's a factor as well. Once we get some hail damaged pods, there may be more increased risk of pod shatter. So the pod shatter tolerant varieties may be a little bit more resilient in these situations. And then it's also important to note that most of our yield is coming from those lower pods compared to the top pods. So we just need to consider that when we're assessing the damage, and even considering maybe desiccation or swathing timing decisions if we're around that time, especially when the hail hits. Moving into durum, that's probably the next most, or another major crop in our area. So again, in those vegetative early stages, the crop's going to recover pretty well early on. But once we get into those reproductive stages, we're going to see more damage. So when the crop's starting to boot and stem elongation is occurring, we can start to see stems that are bent down or broken. If we don't see much of that, there may not be too much loss as the heads are still protected, and definitely more damage compared to younger plants. But we're going to get the most loss when heads are knocked off, kernels, the stems are bent down, like that type of damage on those specific plants, they're not going to recover from as well. The next crop I'll talk about is lentils. So lentils can actually be more resilient, and we can actually see really minimal losses early on. So as we get into the further node stages, then the flowering stages, then the potting stages, we're going to see more loss. Obviously some delayed maturity and possibly reduced yields. They do have nodules, so that can help kickstart their regrowth a little bit as well. And they can produce more pods after hail depending on the stage of the crop and the time of the event. They are an indeterminate crop. But just note that damaged plants can be quite hard to harvest in some cases, because we're going to have more pods near the ground. Flattened plants, they're just going to be harder to pick up with our combine headers. But just to recap, for all three of those crops, like once they reach the reproductive stages, there's going to be less time to recover and possibly more yield losses, versus when they're in the early vegetative stages, they can recover quite a bit better. So hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, fantastic. It was great how you're able to kind of walk through those stages and how it affects it. But so I'm wondering, if you have a crop and let's say it's been injured or it's been impacted a little bit later in the season, kind of, at or beyond those reproductive stages, and it might not reach full maturity, what kind of options do customers and farmers have?
Yeah, so it depends on the extent of the damage. Again, the stage of the crop. I'll probably always preach that. But if we can't make it to harvest, there are other options, especially in Western Canada, such as green feed, baling the crop for straw, that kind of thing. So there is other options before we call it a complete loss for sure.
Definitely. So if you have hail come through and it rips the plant or it gets bruised, sometimes that can open up the window for disease or fungus. So what is your opinion on applying fungicide after hail, for example?
Yeah, I would say that's actually a pretty common question that agronomists get following hail events. And the first thing I like to remember is fungicides are preventative, not curative in most cases. hail damage also doesn't necessarily mean permanent damage. So there is wounds on plants in most cases following hail, and they can provide an entry point mostly for bacteria, maybe in some cases fungus, to create an infection. So if conditions are right, there could be potential for increased risk of disease for sure. Fungicides don't have any activity on bacterial infections, just fungal infections. So that's also important to note. Especially later in season, if this is happening, our crops may be more mature, so there may be more intensive damage, and the fungicide might actually not save us a lot of yield. So timing is going to be really important as well. But what's most important is really just watch our fields. Let's monitor what they're doing, how they're growing out of the event. And we want to make those decisions based on kind of the same things we would in a normal situation. What's our yield potential, stage of the crop? Is there disease out there? Like, what's the pressure right now? And what's the expected pressure based on our growing conditions, based on our historical weather and our forecasted weather? And again, we just want to give that crop some time. So how is it growing through and recovering from the damage? We don't want to just go out the next day and spray a whole bunch of stuff on the crop because we haven't really assessed how the crop is recovering from that. Again, one thing I like to bring up when we're talking about that is pre-harvest intervals, especially if we're getting a little bit later in the season. So just keep an eye on those.
It sounds like damage can really vary from A to Z, and depending on so many different factors, the crop will recover or not recover in different ways. So I know you talked about baling, and then we also talked about potential fungicide applications, but are there any other rescue options that you think that farmers should consider?
Yeah, that's also a pretty common question. I would say short answer, there's not a whole bunch you can do in terms of a miracle after hail application. There is a little bit of research out there, not too much. Some of it's showing that it's just unlikely to be economically helpful in all situations. So there's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to see an improvement from applying different products. What we can say is that you're going to increase your cost of production, but there's not necessarily a guarantee that you're going to see a yield boost from that application. Time and moisture, honestly, are some of the best treatments for hail damaged crops. So again, I'm going to bring up, I'm from Southwest Saskatchewan. So in some areas around here, we're going through a drought again. So sometimes if you have a really light hail, but it comes with lots of moisture, the moisture can actually do more benefit to the crop than the hail damage hindered it, if that makes sense. But yeah, time and moisture will definitely help crops recover in most cases. When we're talking about rescue products, I would say that fungicides and foliar applied nutrients are probably the most talked about or most asked about. And again, like, there's pretty little research done in this area, and it's not all consistent. There is some new stuff out of Alberta where they use a hail simulator machine, and a lot of those papers that I've read, they suggest that there's not necessarily going to be a positive economic effect or an effect at all. I guess if we're talking about foliar applied nitrogen too, there's some things to consider. So we want to consider what our nutrient plan is prior to the storm. So if we're talking about canola, for example, and we were already planning a split application, we may want to go ahead with that application if we were already planning to top dress, because we were accounting for that nitrogen from that to hit our yield goal. But again, we want to consider the stage of the crop, nutrient uptake, all of those things, and what our new yield potential might be. Did the storm reduce this yield potential, or are we still in the same ballpark and want to get that done? I think the most important thing on this topic would be, if you're going to use some applications, use check strips as well. Like, don't just spray the whole field, leave some spots so we can actually compare how the crop's looking in those different areas, and if there's maybe an economic benefit from applying the product on your farm.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all of the questions that I have for you today, but I do see a fantastic question in the chat here. And the question is wondering about how far in advance can we forecast hail? And I know we have the FarmCommand radar map. So did you want to maybe touch on that and how it connects into hail?
Yeah, so like I was kind of saying with the radar part, that's probably the best place that I would look at this time to forecast. So what's really nice about the radar part in the app is you can actually overlay it with your fields. while still looking at the radar and the different colors on the scheme to see what's coming and if it's going to hit your farm. As a timeline, I would say it's only as good as what the radar can provide us. But yeah, that's the main one that I would use to help answer that question.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I don't see any other questions in the live stream chat here, but Skye, do you have any closing words that you'd like to share with our audience today?
Sure, yeah. I would say just if you have a hail event come through, utilize these tools. They're helpful. And if you are not a current Farmer's Edge customer, don't hesitate to reach out to anyone and we can talk to you more about the tools and other options that we have. And when we are scouting hail damage after a storm, I would say let's wait and see how the plants are going to grow through that damage and make decisions based on that. But the main effect that the hail damage is going to have is the stage of the crop, severity, that kind of thing. So yeah, all those things in mind.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Skye, for sharing your knowledge. Deal with a hail event. So I appreciate your time, and thanks to everyone for joining our live today. Take care.
Thank you.